There's an old saying that goes, can they do it on a cold rainy night in Stoke? Well, 100 years ago, a young Sir Stanley Matthews was doing exactly that on a weekly basis and continued doing so for decades until he was carried off the pitch like a king by players like Puskas, Eusebio and Yashin in his final ever game. This is the man who was dribbling like this wearing his Asda George school trousers. I've dug up the most HD tapes for today's lesson, and these pictures genuinely look like the footage of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon. Yet somehow, the ball will stick to his foot like glue. Our first class last week was about one of the greatest dribblers ever, who never became an all-timer because he loved partying too much to bother training. Well, Sir Stanley Matthews was the complete opposite. This is the story of a guy who was ending careers as a teenager in the 1930s, had a break for World War II, and then came back to carry on dominating top-level football until he was 50 years old. So what was his secret? Well, once we take it back to the beginning, it will make sense pretty quickly. Grab your pen and paper, it's time to educate ourselves on England's best ever winger. Stanley was born in 1915 during the height of World War I. When kids are born nowadays, we immediately think about Project Mbappe, training them as soon as they step out the womb. Well, Stan's dad, a boxer himself, was on Project Pichichi to turn his son into the shooter you see on your screens right now. By 6 years old, this guy was an expert in deep breathing exercises, chest expanding and skipping down the beach, the same way he'd be skipping past fullbacks as he got into his teenage years. This neek was even doing fasting and detoxing to ensure he was at maximum capacity when he joined Stoke's reserves in 1929, aged 14. He played 22 games for the reserves, and the olders would give him a nice cheeky 2 shillings from their bonuses after every win. But he didn't need this for long, as he'd signed professionally by 17 on the top available wage of £5 per week. Imagine being one of these alcoholic first division fullbacks and seeing this kid breeze past you like Tyson's Dragoon Beyblade. I'll be telling my coach to sub me up so I can go fight in the war instead. They were already calling this guy the Wizard of Dribble as he glided down the wing rocking that now iconic number 7 on his back. His relentless sprinting down the wing and pinpoint crosses got Stoke promoted to Division 1 a year later, and with that came his first England cap. His international debut came against Wales at the age of 19, and he ended up scoring the 3rd goal in a 4-0 win. But his trajectory was like that of a ride at Alton Towers, because after the maximum high of another win against world champions Italy, the bloodbath that ensued in that game was a sign that it was about to take a nosedive. You see, his 3rd game was against the Giants of Germany in 1935, and it's fair to say that he got absolutely padlocked by Reinhold Munzenberg. Think Reece James vs Wilfried Zaha levels of pocketed. The England fans were booing him and the press were hounding him like they did for David Beckham all those decades later. Speaking of whom, Stanley walked so David could run. You see how we call it bend it like Beckham today? In the 1930s they had swerve it like Stanley. I definitely just made that up on the spot. But look how he's whipping these crosses in for these clowns to keep on missing. Yet it was he who took all the responsibility on his shoulders, even after a 2-year break with the national team, before coming back and losing again versus Scotland. Regardless, his name grew to such an extent that he alone would attract an extra 10,000 people to show up at away games, just to see him tie defenders together like a shoelace. His first overseas international was in Germany in 1938, and those of you who know your world history, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Stanley already had enough on his plate worrying about the rematch against Munzenberg, but the world was watching as the British government instructed the FA to make sure every player does a certain salute towards a certain someone in the crowd before kickoff as an act of appeasement. On the bright side, Stan escaped the pocket of Munzenberg and snatched his chain back as England ran riot in a 6-3 win. The bad news is that the geezer watching in the stand decided to start a full-scale war against the entire world. As you can imagine, this is a bit of an inconvenience for a 24-year-old Stanley who hadn't even reached his peak yet. They had this electric winger doing up Royal Air Force shifts, but he still made time for 69 league and cup games for Stoke, as well as somehow being allowed to make 87 unofficial appearances for Blackpool. It seems like back then there were just simply no rules anymore, because he even had a shift playing for Arsenal against Dynamo Moscow, and then a cheeky run out for a Scotland 11 before the war ended. Unfortunately for Matthews, his father was to pass away in 1945, and from his deathbed he made his son promise 2 things: to look after his mother and to win an FA Cup final. You'd think that at age 30 he'd be winding down his career, especially with how barely anyone cared about nutrition and longevity back in the day. But this guy was only just starting. After doubts about his future at Stoke, he used the motivation of his dad to spearhead Stoke to their record finish in the league, finishing just 2 points behind champions Liverpool and being responsible for 30 of their 41 goals scored that season. However, his relationship with the board was already irreparable, and he handed in a transfer request yet again, this time getting a move to Blackpool for £11,500 and a bottle of whiskey. The announcement was made straight after he once again lit it up for Great Britain as they smoked a rest of Europe side 6-1 in front of 134,000 people in Glasgow. One of the Belgian defenders who had the unfortunate task of marking Matthews stated that it was like trying to mark a ghost. The Blackpool manager Smith told Matthews that there were no shackles here, he's free to express himself, and that he had their full support, hoping that he'd squeeze the final 2 years out of his career. In the 1947-48 season, Matthews was part of a superstar forward trio that carried them to a 9th place finish and an FA Cup final. Now if you remember, this was the one thing that he wanted to achieve in his career. In fact, the night before the final, he won the first ever edition of the Football Writers Association's Footballer of the Year award. But his job wasn't finished. They'd take the lead twice in the final, but unfortunately they fell short and lost 4-2 against Matt Busby's Manchester United. Still, he continued to drop masterclasses and was determined to one day fulfill his promise, reaching the FA Cup final again in 1951. This time, they were the favourites, yet he was on the losing side once again against Newcastle United. At 37, it was now looking unlikely that he'd ever get it over the line. The manager Joe Smith dropped an inspirational speech and promised Matthews that an FA Cup medal was still within the realms of possibility, proclaiming, "A lot of people will call me mad, but even though you're 37, your best football is still yet to come." And when he dropped this "let me land" type speech, a lot of guys were asking, what is he cooking? Now 38, he reached a third FA Cup final, but they found themselves trailing 3-1 to Bolton in the second half. Then, like Goku when he closed his eyes to think about his family before going Ultra Instinct, Matthews dropped a Hall of Fame 30 minutes, collecting 3 assists to win 4-3 in the last minute and secure that elusive FA Cup medal handed to him by Queen Elizabeth II herself. The fact they called it the Matthews final despite Mortensen bagging a hat-trick tells you everything you need to know. Yet he still had more crazy achievements loading. Despite not being in the England setup much anymore, his club performances were enough for him to be awarded the very first ever Ballon d'Or awarded in 1956 at the age of 41. This got him called back up to the England squad for their first ever friendly against Brazil. And let me tell you, he absolutely roasted a prime Nilton Santos, who at this point was already regarded as the best fullback in football history. The shoulder drops and shot cancels had even the Brazilians shaking. That's how you know this guy was special. He inspired England to a 4-2 victory against a team that was about to become the champions at the World Cup. And yet, this guy was still not done. His next adventure will take him to Ghana of all places. Stanley Matthews pulled up to Ghana in 1957, now 42 years old, to play some exhibition matches for Accra Heart of Oak. He'd regularly attract 20,000 Ghanaian fans to every game and was given the title of Soccer Chief for his influence in the development of Ghanaian football, convincing Ghana's first Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah to invest more into the sport. He'd give up his summers every year between 1953 and 1978 to coach poor children in South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda and Tanzania, even while his career was still ongoing. After a nice spell in Toronto, his time with Blackpool was up and he got his desired move back home to Stoke, who were now in the 2nd division back then. As you'd expect by now, a 48-year-old Stanley Matthews picked up Player of the Year once again as he propelled Stoke from mediocrity back up into the big league. His game time would decline until he reached his 50th birthday and decided to hang up his boots after being the first active player to receive a knighthood. You get a glimpse of this guy's worldwide impact when you see the list of players desperate to participate in his final testimonial game in April 1965. Yashin, Puskas, Eusebio, Di Stefano all pulled out to play against him one final time. They'd carry him off on their shoulders into the sunset, where he'd spend his years coaching in England and breaking racial boundaries in an apartheid-ridden South Africa. His legacy is undisputed, and Pele himself said he was the man who taught us the way football should be played. Hopefully you guys have learned something new today, and when guys ask you about all-time dribblers, make sure Sir Stanley Matthews gets a mention. Let me know what players you want to hear more about from your country, leave a like on this video, and subscribe for weekly videos on players from all eras. Class dismissed.